In this lecture, we are going to close out our very long series on the EU AI Act by talking about other AI operator or supply chain responsibilities. One really tricky nuance here is that a non-provider under certain circumstances may become a provider. And so again, if I was a tricky exam writer, this is where I'm really going to try and get people to lose points. Here we're going to discuss becoming a provider, responsibilities for new providers, provider protections. We're going to talk about the amorphous product manufacturer, as well as third-party miscellaneous components. So it's important to understand that under the EU AI Act, non-provider AI operators, for example, deployers, importers, distributors, and other third parties, may become a provider when certain actions are taken. When this happens, that new provider is now subject to Article 16. And you'll remember that Article 16 says you're responsible for all of these other articles. The primary triggers that you need to know for the exam are as follows. The deployers, importers, distributors, and other third parties may become a provider when, for a post-market system, the following happens. The AI operator puts their own name or trademark on the system regardless of contractual arrangements. When the AI operator makes a substantial modification, or when there's a modification to a non-high-risk system, which post-modification becomes high risk. When there is a new provider, the previous provider is no longer the provider. They are no longer the accountable AI operator. However, the original provider must cooperate with the new provider. For example, providing technical access, compliance, conformity assessments, or other technical documentation. Now, there are some provider protections. The original provider can draft contractual language that prohibits modification of their system or model. And if that contractual language is in place and a change is still made, then the original provider has no obligation to provide that technical documentation. Now, you'll remember early on in this series, I talked about the product manufacturer never really being a product manufacturer. And so what I meant by that is that a product manufacturer under some circumstances can become a provider or a deployer, that there are no obligations that apply to the product manufacturer itself. If you are a pure product manufacturer, if you are not a deployer, if you are not a provider, there are no obligations that apply to you. This is because a product manufacturer is considered a provider for a high-risk system if that system is used as a safety component of a product. So you create a product or service, you incorporate into that product or service a high-risk system, you are now a provider, and so those provider obligations apply to you. As we saw at the beginning of this lecture, the product manufacturer, who is now a provider, must comply with Article 16. Similarly, the product manufacturer must comply with Article 16 when the system is deployed under its name or trademark. In our final slide, I want to just go over some miscellaneous notes for third parties. When third parties provide tools, services, components, or other processes that are used or integrated into a high-risk system, those third parties must specify via contracts with the provider the necessary information, capabilities, and technical access necessary to assist the provider with compliance. An exclusion here is open source third-party tools, except for general purpose AI models. One thing to keep an eye out for is that the AI office may develop a set of voluntary model terms for contracts similar to the GDPR's standard contractual clauses. In this lecture, we concluded our series on the EU AI Act by going over some miscellaneous notes concerning AI operator or supply chain responsibilities. Remember that a deployer, importer, distributor, and other third party may become a provider when certain actions are taken. When one of those AI operators becomes a new provider, the previous provider is no longer considered the accountable provider. Provider protections including contractual language prohibiting modification, and if under such a contract, a change is still made, the original provider has no obligation to provide technical documentation to the new provider. Watch out on the exam for any scenario or question that talks about product manufacturers. A product manufacturer is considered a provider for high-risk systems that are integrated into products as a safety component. Under this situation, the product manufacturer must comply with Article 16. Also, when a product manufacturer deploys a system under its own name and trademark, that product manufacturer must now comply with Article 16. Finally, when third parties provide tools, services, components, or processes that are used or integrated into high-risk systems, those parties must specify via contract with the provider the necessary information, capabilities, and technical access to assist that provider in complying with its obligations.